Going down to take out the trash, I happened to see my mother-in-law hiding in the shadows, frantically sprinkling a white powder into my takeout order. I quietly took the food and gave it to my husband, who was working late, as a late-night meal. At 3 a.m., my mother-in-law rushed to the hospital to see a man and a woman lying unconscious. My name is Laura. There are nights when you think it's the darkness that suffocates you. But for me, the thing that chilled my heart was a scent as fine as a single hair, weaving through the black pepper and hot seafood, hooking itself directly into my professional memory. I am a pharmacist at a major hospital in Chicago. This profession has taught me a hard-to-shake habit. When others smell something delicious, I smell something strange. When others smell something new, I smell something old. If something is not right, even by the slightest margin, I notice. Sometimes that habit saves lives. Sometimes it saves my own. That night, it was nearly 1 a.m. I was holding the bag of seafood chowder that had just been delivered, standing in the hallway of my condo building. The motion sensor light had just flickered off, plunging the corridor into a thick silence, as if everyone was already asleep, leaving only the hum of air conditioners and the distant whir of the elevator. I was about to head up to our unit when the scent hit my nose. It wasn't a fishy smell, nor a burnt one. It was the dry, slightly acrid scent of a powder, like chalk dust mixed with something bitter. Anyone else might have thought the food was off, or the seafood wasn't fresh, but I didn't think so. I knew the smell of crushed medication when it meets heat, especially the kind that causes a severe reaction when mixed with alcohol. I stood frozen, my hand gripping the bag so tightly my fingers went numb. 3 minutes earlier, I had seen it clearly. Betty, my mother-in-law, who had been feigning a simple, country demeanor while living with us for over 6 months, was hiding behind the second-floor fire escape door. She didn't know I had gone down to the trash chute and would be back so quickly. I had only taken a few steps up the stairs when I saw her shadow. She was hunched over, as if afraid of being seen, holding a small spoon, the kind we never used in our house. She opened the lid of the chowder container, sprinkled a white powder inside, and then closed it carefully, even wiping the rim with her finger as if to remove any trace. Then she slipped back into her room, closing the door so softly the latch made no sound. I stood on the stairs like a statue, not out of fear, but out of understanding. In our kitchen, there was wine. Every night before bed, I had a small glass to help me sleep. My husband, Nathan, used to tease me about it. "Just a little, honey. Get a good night's sleep for work tomorrow." Who knew about that habit? The people who lived in this house knew. And there were only 3 people in this house. Me, Nathan, and his mother. I didn't want to believe it, but everything pointed to an answer I despised. Nathan, my gentle, soft-spoken husband, whose dress shirts were always perfectly pressed. Nathan was the man who had made me believe that decent men existed in this world. We had been married for 5 years, with no children. Betty hated me for it. She never insulted me directly, but she had countless ways of making me feel like an outsider in my own home. She called me her daughter-in-law, but her tone always sounded like she was addressing hired help. She would sigh dramatically or make pointed remarks. "The neighbor's house is filled with the sound of children's laughter. Ours is so quiet." Nathan was always the mediator. "Mom's just like that, Laura. Don't take it to heart." He would put his arm around my shoulder and tell me he loved me. But if he truly loved me, how could his mother dare to do something like this tonight? I looked down at the bag of chowder. The strange scent clung to me. I imagined myself eating it. No, I didn't have to imagine for long. At the hospital, I had seen enough cases of sudden medical crises. Sudden allergic reactions, sudden poisonings. Some deaths looked like an act of God, but in reality, they were meticulously planned. I pulled out my phone. The screen's glow illuminated my pale face in the darkness. I opened the location tracking app Nathan had cheerfully suggested we install when we first got married. "You can see where I am anytime, honey. I have nothing to hide." I had laughed then, thinking how rare a man like that was. The blue dot was not at his office, as he had claimed. It was blinking in an upscale condo complex in River North, a place rumored to be a sanctuary for secret relationships. I looked at the address, my eyes so dry they couldn't produce tears. I called his phone. It rang twice before Nathan answered. His voice was low, as if he was trying to stay calm in a place where he couldn't speak loudly. "Laura, why are you still awake? You're still working late. You should go to sleep. Don't wait for me." Hearing those words, I felt a strange sense of detachment. They were too smooth, as if he had rehearsed them so many times they required no thought. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to sound as gentle as usual. "Honey, I just ordered some seafood chowder, but I can't finish it. I figured you must be hungry working so late. Let me send it over for you." There was a tiny pause on the other end, just a beat, but it was long enough for me to know he was weighing his options. "I'm not hungry. It's late. Don't go to the trouble." I gave a small laugh, trying to sound like a caring wife. "It's no trouble. Just eat it so I can stop worrying. Where are you? I'll have the delivery guy bring it straight there." He answered quickly, as if the excuse was already prepared. "We moved to a different workspace. We're at the Pinnacle Towers, apartment 1602. I froze, not because of the address, but because of how smoothly he recited the apartment number. A man at a team meeting who remembers a room number like his own address? Interesting. I kept my voice steady. "Okay, 1602. Make sure you eat it while it's hot. There's a lot of good stuff in it." Nathan let out a soft sigh, as if a weight had been lifted. "Yeah, you're the best. I love you." He hung up. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the wind whistle through the door cracks. The question in my mind was no longer whether Nathan was having an affair. It was a colder question. What did Nathan want to do to me? I looked at the bag of chowder. I thought of the spoon in Betty's hand. If it was indeed a powdered drug, the person who taught her how to use it had to be someone with knowledge. What would happen when it was mixed with wine? Betty was barely literate. She couldn't tell the difference between a cold pill and a painkiller. She just hated me. She wanted me gone. But she wasn't smart enough to turn that hatred into a clean accident, unless someone had instructed her. I walked quickly down to the lobby. The delivery guy was still there, leaning against his bike, scrolling on his phone. He looked up when he saw me. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" I handed him the bag of chowder along with a $20 bill. I spoke softly, like the most ordinary wife in the world. "I need to change the delivery address. Can you please take this to the Pinnacle Towers, apartment 1602? Make sure you hand it directly to a Mr. Nathan and say his wife sent it as a late-night meal. Tell him to eat it while it's hot." The delivery guy's eyes lit up at the sight of the money. He grinned. "You got it, ma'am. I'll be there in 30 minutes. His scooter sped off, its red taillight painting a thin streak in the night. I went back up to our apartment. I didn't turn on all the lights. I just switched on the kitchen light, poured the glass of wine I had intended to drink, and stared at it for a long time. Finally, I poured it straight down the sink. The red liquid spiraled down the drain like something being severed. Betty was asleep in her room, or pretending to be. I didn't open her door. I didn't wake her. I just went to my own room, changed my clothes, and lay down. My heart beat with a strange regularity. It wasn't because I was numb, but because there are moments when you hurt so much that your emotions shut down just to keep you alive. I closed my eyes and waited for a call I knew would surely come. And as the clock neared 3 a.m., my phone vibrated, its shrill ring cutting through the dark room like a premonition. I had just drifted out of a fitful dream when the phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand. The screen cast a blue glow in the dark room, displaying an unknown number. I let it ring a few more times, just long enough to compose a properly panicked expression, before I answered. My voice was hoarse, like someone jolted from a deep sleep. "Hello, who is this?" The voice on the other end was a man's, urgent, accompanied by the muffled sound of other people talking and the unmistakable beeping of machines, the signature sounds of an emergency room. "Is this Laura? This is Metropolitan General Hospital Emergency Department. Nathan is in our care. His condition is critical. A family member needs to come immediately." I heard the words, "condition is critical," and my heart seized for a beat. Even though I had expected it, the physical reaction still hit me like a punch to the chest. but I couldn't afford to collapse. I had to play the part of the unknowing wife, both devastated and confused, so that everything would follow the path they themselves had laid. Emergency? What do you mean, emergency? He said he was at work. Doctor, what's wrong with him? Severe food poisoning, complicated by a reaction with alcohol. Please come right away and bring his identification. The line went dead, giving me no chance to ask more. I sat bolt upright, the back of my shirt cold with sweat. For a few seconds, I stared into the darkness ahead, as if looking at a door that had been opened for me, with no way to turn back. Immediately, the phone rang again. This time, it was my mother-in-law's number. I answered, and before I could speak, Betty's voice screamed through the phone, shattered like a bowl dropped on a tile floor. "Laura, where are you? Get to the hospital, now!" "Nathan, he's not going to make it. Oh, God." Betty called me her daughter, for the first time, in that tone. Before, her words were always laced with an undercurrent of contempt. But now, that word wasn't a term of endearment. It was the cry of someone being pushed to the edge of a cliff by her own hands. I forced my voice to sound frantic. "Mom, what are you saying? Why the hospital? I'm coming right now." I didn't put on makeup. I purposely didn't fix my hair. I threw on a jacket, slipped on mismatched slippers, and shoved my phone and wallet into my purse like someone in a state of shock and panic. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway, where the yellow light cast a cold glow on the floor. Betty's door flew open. She rushed out, her face ashen, her hair a mess, her eyes wide as if she no longer recognized me. "What did you do? What did you send him to eat? Don't you know he drinks alcohol? Oh my God!" I stood still, looking directly at her. I didn't argue. I just let her talk, because with her own words, she was tightening the noose around her own neck. She was crying and terrified, and within that fear was the foul stench of guilt. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I sent chowder. Just chowder. Nathan was working late. I was afraid he was hungry. "Mom, calm down. Let's go to the hospital." Betty looked at me, her lips trembling. She seemed to want to say more, but swallowed it down. There are truths people dare not speak in a hallway, because a single slip of the tongue is enough to make the world spin out of control. On the way to the hospital, I drove with my hands stiff as wood. Chicago at 3 a.m. has an emptiness that makes the turmoil in your heart even louder. The streetlights stretched into blurry streaks. I rolled down the window, letting the cold wind hit my face to keep me alert. I remembered my wedding night. Nathan had held my hand and said, "Laura, I will never let you suffer." I had believed him. I had believed in a man who could hold me while I slept and plot my death in his mind. If it weren't for that strange, powdery scent, if I had drunk my glass of wine like every other night, if I had followed the routine they had grasped so perfectly, the person on that gurney right now would have been me. I had just parked the car when I saw Betty had arrived before me by taxi. She stumbled into the emergency department, her hand clutching her purse strap as if it were a lifeline. I followed, walking quickly but not running. I had to maintain an appearance of being both distraught and composed, like a wife who still had her dignity in the midst of a storm. The strong smell of antiseptic, familiar to the point of pain. White lights, waiting room chairs, the squeak of shoes on the floor, voices calling out, the constant beeping of monitors. I saw Betty slumped on the floor in front of the ER doors, her hands clasped as if in prayer, muttering, "Nathan, my son, my son." I walked over and touched her shoulder. "Mom, get up. Let's ask the doctor." Betty looked up. In her eyes, there were tears, panic, and something like hatred. She was about to lunge at me, but then stopped herself. I knew she was scared. Scared I would reveal what she had done, scared people would ask questions, scared of all the staring eyes. Most of all, she was scared of the truth. The ER door opened. A doctor stepped out, pulling down his mask, his face weary. I took a step forward, my voice just shaky enough. "Doctor, I'm Nathan's wife. How is he?" The doctor looked at me, his gaze a mixture of pity and seriousness. "He has severe poisoning, complicated by a reaction with alcohol. We're working on him, but his condition is deteriorating. The family should prepare for the worst. I heard the phrase, prepare for the worst, and my mind went blank. I grabbed the arm of a chair to stay upright, forcing my lips to tremble like someone about to faint. Behind me, Betty began to wail louder, as if trying to wash away her sins with tears. "Doctor, please save him. He's my son." The doctor nodded and went back inside. And just then, from the end of the hall, another gurney was wheeled past. On it was a woman with long hair, her face pale, her lips a purplish blue, covered to her neck with a blanket. A nurse walked alongside, speaking quickly. "Maintain the airway, monitor blood pressure." I only saw her face for a moment, but it was long enough for me to recognize her. Not as a patient I knew from the ER, but as someone my husband knew. Because I had seen that profile picture peeking out from Nathan's phone once when he had accidentally left the screen on before quickly shutting it off. I hadn't paid attention then. Now, I remembered it perfectly. Betty saw her too. She froze as if someone had thrown cold water on her. Her pupils contracted, and her sobs caught in her throat, turning into a dry, hacking sound. "That girl, why is she here?" I turned to her, my voice quiet but as sharp as a thread. "You know her, Mom?" Betty flinched. She looked around, as if afraid someone would overhear. But how could you hide it? The hallway was full of people whose eyes were already turning curious. And curiosity in a hospital at dawn is always followed by harsh speculation. Betty stammered, unable to form a complete sentence. "No, I don't know her. I don't know." I nodded slightly, feigning confusion. "I don't know either. Nathan said he was working. So why is she here? With him?" Betty suddenly clutched her head and slumped down, her breathing ragged. She was trapped between two pincers, on one side, her son, on the other, the secret she had been protecting. And in the middle was the bowl of chowder with the white powder that she herself had sprinkled in. She wanted to blame it all on me, but she didn't dare. She wanted to drag me down with her, but she had no way out. I stood there, looking at her with the eyes of a daughter-in-law who had endured enough. But deeper still, I also looked at her with the eyes of a woman who understood the fears of mothers from small towns. Fear of losing a son, fear of losing their support, fear of the family line ending, fear of being ridiculed by the neighbors. It was that fear that had turned her into a cruel person. The ER door opened again. This time, a doctor came out with a nurse. The nurse, holding a clipboard, called out, "Family of Nathan, we need a signature on these forms." I stepped forward. Betty scrambled to her feet, her hand grabbing my sleeve like a drowning person clutching a post. "Laura, you sign. You're his wife." I signed. My handwriting didn't shake. I just made my eyes red, my voice choked. I knew I had to stand firm, because if I crumbled, the whole truth would spill out uncontrollably. As the doctor was explaining the situation, I overheard a phrase that sent a chill down my spine. He consumed alcohol after eating. The reaction was very severe. Betty flinched. I could feel the hand gripping my sleeve tighten. "Mom, did you hear that?" I turned and whispered into her ear, a sharp reminder. "Nathan drank alcohol." Betty looked at me. In that moment, I saw a horrifying realization dawn on her. The powder she had sprinkled wasn't just to give Laura a stomach ache or make her sick for a few days. It was something that could kill if combined with alcohol. She thought she was punishing her daughter-in-law, but in the end, the one who paid the price was her own son, and the other woman, who might very well have been carrying another life inside her. Betty suddenly let out a cry as if she'd been stabbed. "Oh God, Nathan!" She started to stumble and then collapsed right in front of the door. Nurses rushed to help her. People gathered around. I also bent down, took her hand, and called her by the name she always insisted I use. But now, I said it in a different voice, the voice of someone who had walked through fear. "Mom, stay calm. Listen to me. You have to live to see how this all plays out." Betty opened her eyes, her lips pale. She pulled me closer, her breath ragged. "Laura, I didn't mean it. I looked at her without pushing her away. I just spoke slowly, as if to someone who had just fallen into a deep chasm. "I know you didn't mean to kill anyone, Mom, but you did it. Some things, even if you don't mean for them to happen, still have a price. Betty sobbed. It was no longer the sound of a tantrum, but the cry of someone who suddenly realized their whole life had gone wrong with one misstep, which then rolled into an unstoppable descent. Just then, my phone vibrated. I looked at the screen. It was the delivery guy. I answered. "Ma'am, I made the delivery." A guy came to the door. His face was really pale, and I could hear a woman's voice inside. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I murmured a quiet, "Yes," my throat tight with a stone-like lump. "Thank you." I hung up. I stood up and looked at the closed door of the emergency room. Behind that door was a man who had once called me his wife, who had said he loved me, who had built a home only to systematically push me out of it. I felt no joy, no satisfaction. I only felt a vast emptiness in my chest, where trust had been completely wiped away. But I also felt something else. I was still alive, and those who are alive still have the power to choose. I couldn't go back to being the naive wife. I couldn't continue being the silent, submissive daughter-in-law. Tonight, all the masks had begun to fall. And when the masks fall, the only thing left is consequence. I turned to look at Betty. She was sitting on a chair, her eyes vacant, like someone who had just woken from a dream and couldn't believe it was real. I handed her a bottle of water and said softly, "Drink this, Mom, and then you're going to tell me. Who was Nathan with at the Pinnacle? How long have you known? And the powder you put in the chowder, where did you get it?" Betty held the bottle, her hands trembling. She looked at me as if I were a stranger, then as if I were her last hope. I knew her answer would open another door. And behind that door was not just betrayal, but a plan, and I, Laura, would have to walk through it. Betty sat in silence for a long time, the water bottle untouched in her hand. Her lips were cracked and dry, her eyes staring blankly into the space in front of her, as if replaying fragmented memories being dragged out and exposed under the harsh white hospital lights. I didn't rush her. Some truths, when forced, only result in lies. I waited, the same way I would wait for a patient to recover from a drug-induced shock, not pushing, not prodding, just observing their breathing and their eyes. Finally, Betty spoke, her voice raspy. "Laura, do you believe me?" I looked at her. For the first time in years, I saw my mother-in-law as just an old woman who was scared and lost, no longer the nitpicking matriarch, not yet a convicted criminal. I gave a slight nod. "I believe you will tell the truth, but I don't believe you are innocent." Betty closed her eyes, tears squeezing out and rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. "I never thought it would come to this. I swear to you, I only wanted you to get sick so Nathan would have a reason to divorce you. I didn't think he would die." I didn't interject. I just asked short, precise questions. "Where did you get that powder?" Betty trembled. She opened her eyes and looked at me as if into a mirror reflecting herself. "Nathan gave it to me." The words fell in the hospital corridor like a heavy stone. I had suspected as much, but hearing her say it aloud, my heart still ached. Not from surprise, but from the cold realization of how a human being could hand his own mother a drug and tell her to go harm his wife. "When did Nathan give it to you?" I asked, my voice steady, though a storm was raging in my chest. "About a week ago. He said it was just crushed-up antibiotics. He said you always drink wine at night, and if I mixed it into the chowder, you'd have an allergic reaction and have to be hospitalized, but you wouldn't die. He said that would make the divorce easier, so he wouldn't have the stigma of leaving a healthy wife." I let out a dry, quiet laugh, but it was bitter. "Did he give you any other instructions?" Betty nodded, her voice a whisper. "He told me to sprinkle it in when you weren't looking. He told me to wipe the container's rim clean. He also said that if you asked, I should just say it was bad takeout food." I closed my eyes for a second. In my mind, I could clearly picture Nathan, sitting somewhere, his voice gentle, his demeanor kind, explaining every detail as if he were instructing a nurse on how to administer medication. The man who had held my hand before our family altar and promised to be with me through sickness and in health. That same man had, step by step, taught his own mother how to push me closer to death. "Do you know why Nathan wanted a divorce?" I pressed on. Betty fell silent. then lowered her head. I knew. I looked straight at her. It was because of that woman who was just wheeled into the ER, wasn't it? Betty didn't answer immediately, but her silence was the loudest confession. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. He said you couldn't have children. He said she was pregnant. I was so happy. I thought our family would finally have a grandchild. My judgment was clouded. I listened, my heart feeling hollow. So it wasn't just betrayal, but complicity. It wasn't just a husband's affair, but an entire family quietly choosing to discard me. In their eyes, I wasn't a person, but an obstacle to be neatly removed. So you knew she was pregnant? How many months? I asked. Almost 2 months. Nathan said it was a boy. I gave a faint, cynical smile. In my profession, you can't tell the gender at 2 months. But I didn't correct her. What I needed wasn't a biology lesson, but the truth behind it all. Did Nathan mention anything about assets? I continued. Betty looked up, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He said, "If you were hospitalized in serious condition or died from the reaction, the insurance would pay out a large sum. He and I could use it to take care of the grandchild." I took a deep breath. The air in the hospital was cold, but I felt a burning heat in my chest. That was it. No more doubts. This was a plan. A premeditated, calculated plan with an instructor and an executioner. And if I hadn't caught that strange scent tonight, if I had continued to trust Nathan as I always had, the person lying behind that ER door would have been me. Betty. I said her name directly, no longer calling her Mom. "Do you realize what you've just admitted to?" Betty grew frantic. I only told you. Don't tell anyone. I'm an old woman. I can't handle it." I stood up and looked down at her slowly. "I don't need you to handle it. I need the truth. And this truth is not for me to keep for you." Betty froze. "Laura, what are you going to do?" Before I could answer, the ER door swung open. A doctor walked out, his expression heavy. "Family of Nathan." I stepped forward. "Yes, that's me. We did everything we could. He had a severe drug reaction due to the alcohol, and his heart failed to respond. Time of death was 3:20 a.m. My mind went numb. I knew this was coming. I was prepared. But hearing those words, time of death, I still felt my knees go weak. I held onto the edge of a desk, tears welling up in my eyes, real tears. Not tears of sorrow for him, but tears for a marriage that had died in the most brutal way imaginable. From across the hall, a scream tore through the air. It was the other woman's mother. She rushed out of another room, screaming her daughter's name, screaming the name of a grandchild that would never be born. I saw a nurse run after her, her face tense. In that moment, I knew this tragedy was no longer just my own. Betty collapsed into her chair, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. I looked at her, then at the door of the room where a white sheet had just been pulled over Nathan's face. A swift end for a man who had planned for so long. Less than 10 minutes later, the police arrived. They were quiet, working like people accustomed to the scent of death. A young officer approached me. "Ma'am, are you Nathan's wife?" "Yes. We need your cooperation. There are signs of drug-related poisoning." I nodded calmly. "I'm ready." Hearing this, Betty shot up and grabbed my arm. "Laura, don't say anything. If you talk, I'll go to jail." I looked at her, my eyes no longer filled with anger, just exhaustion. "Betty, even if you're not afraid of prison, you should be afraid of living with this guilt for the rest of your life. I'm not killing you. I'm just returning you to where the truth belongs." I turned to the police officer. "Officer, I have important information, and I can provide evidence." The officer's gaze sharpened. He nodded. "Ma'am, please come with us to a private room." I followed them. Behind me, Betty's sobs echoed down the hallway. It was no longer the sound of a mother mourning her son, but the sound of someone who had just realized she had single-handedly destroyed everything. When the door to the small office closed, I sat down and placed my hands on the table. I took a deep breath, my mind replaying every detail, every scent, every word with perfect clarity. I knew that from this moment on, I was no longer the victim being pushed around in the dark. I was the one who would tell the truth. And the truth, once spoken, would not stop at a single death. The small office at the hospital was stark, the fluorescent lights so harsh they made my skin look sallow. I sat across from two detectives, one middle-aged, the other younger. The older man introduced himself as Detective Miller, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that had heard every confession imaginable. The younger officer took notes, his eyes studying me carefully. Detective Miller pushed a cup of warm water toward me. "Miss Collins, please take your time. We need you to tell us everything from the beginning. Whatever you know, just say it." I nodded. My hands wrapped around the cup, its warmth spreading through my palms but doing little to calm my heart. I knew that every word I spoke here would be irreversible. But if I didn't speak, I would have to live in cowardly silence, something I could no longer do. "Tonight, I ordered seafood chowder for delivery," I began, my voice slow and clear. When I went down to the trash chute and came back up, I saw my mother-in-law, Betty Collins, secretly sprinkling a white powder into the container. The younger officer looked up at me. Detective Miller didn't interrupt. "I work in pharmacology," I continued, "so I'm very sensitive to scents. I recognized it as a powdered drug, specifically an antibiotic from a group known to cause severe reactions when taken with alcohol. I didn't eat it. Instead, I called my husband, Nathan. He said he was working late, so I offered to send the chowder to him for a late-night meal. "Did you know where Mr. Collins was at that time?" Detective Miller asked. I checked his location on a tracking app. He was at the Pinnacle Towers in River North, not his office. I continued without omitting a single detail: the phone call, the apartment address, giving the chowder back to the delivery driver. When I got to the part about receiving the call from the ER, my voice grew hoarse, but I didn't stop. At the hospital, I met my mother-in-law. Later, I saw another woman being brought into the ER, the one who was with my husband. I recognized her as the woman Nathan had been seeing. Detective Miller nodded, jotting down a few notes. "And Mrs. Collins, did she admit to putting the powder in the food?" I paused for a few seconds, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "Nathan himself gave her the drug. He instructed her on how to put it in the chowder when I wasn't looking. The purpose was for me to have a severe allergic reaction, be hospitalized, or worse." The room fell silent. The young officer stopped writing and looked at me, his expression one of undisguised shock. "What did Nathan tell his mother?" Detective Miller asked, his voice deepening. "He said he wanted to divorce me. He had another woman who was pregnant. He said if I died in an accident, the insurance would pay out and the assets would be left for him and his mother to take care of his child." Detective Miller let out a long breath. I saw in his eyes not just the sternness of a lawman, but also a hint of human sorrow. "Do you have any proof of what you've just told us?" I nodded. "I have a video from the security camera outside my apartment door. It recorded the entire act of Betty putting the powder into the container. I also kept the unused portion of the chowder, which I'm sure still has traces of the substance." The young officer immediately wrote this down. Detective Miller looked at me for a long time before speaking slowly. "Miss Collins, your testimony is crucial, but you need to prepare yourself. This is no longer just an accident. It could become a criminal homicide case." I gave a bitter smile. "Detective, from the moment I smelled that powder, I was prepared. If I hadn't been alert, the person dead right now would be me." The door opened and a nurse came in, speaking quietly to Detective Miller. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw his brow furrow slightly before he nodded. "Miss Collins, we need you to sign this preliminary statement. We will also be taking Mrs. Collins into custody for questioning." My heart sank a little. Even though I was prepared, hearing it confirmed was still heavy. "My mother-in-law, how is she?" I asked. "She's in an agitated state, but coherent enough to be questioned." I nodded. I signed my name on the paper, each stroke of the pen feeling like another cut, severing a relationship that had long been rotten. When I walked out of the room, Betty was sitting on a bench in the hallway, her face in her hands. She looked up when she saw me, her eyes filled with panic. "Laura, what did you tell them?" she asked, her voice trembling. I stood before her. In this moment, I was no longer the submissive daughter-in-law, nor the vengeful woman. I was simply a person telling the truth. "I told them exactly what happened," I replied. "Nothing more, nothing less." Betty broke down, her sobs like those of a child. "I didn't want to kill anyone. I just wanted a grandchild, Laura." I looked at her, my heart aching as if squeezed. I remembered the early days of my marriage, when I cooked her meals and called her Mom with genuine affection. But none of that could erase the fact that she had raised her hand to harm me. "Betty," I said quietly, "some mistakes can't be undone with the excuse of not meaning to." 2 police officers approached. They spoke clearly and firmly, asking Betty to come with them for questioning. Betty looked at me one last time, her gaze a mixture of resentment, fear, and regret. I didn't look away. I looked straight back, as if watching the final chapter of an old life close. As they led her away, the hospital corridor felt strangely empty. I stood there alone, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and cold lights. My husband was dead. My mother-in-law was in custody. The other woman, I had overheard a doctor say, didn't make it. Neither did the baby. 3 lives, 1 night. I sat down on a chair, my back against the wall. Only then did the tears fall. Not for Nathan, not really for Betty, but for myself. For 5 years of marriage, that turned out to be nothing more than a chess game where I was the most foolish pawn. My phone rang. It was my dad. The hospital must have contacted him. "Laura, are you okay?" His voice was hoarse with worry. I took a deep breath. "I'm okay, Dad, but I need you to come here. I'm on my way." I hung up and looked at the white ceiling. I knew that from tomorrow on, I would have to face the law, public opinion, both families, and the vicious whispers. But at least I was no longer living in the darkness of deceit. That night, I left the hospital as the sky began to brighten. The first weak rays of dawn hit the steps, blinding me for a moment. I stepped outside and took a breath of fresh air. For the first time in a very long time, I felt truly alive. But I knew this was just the beginning. The morning my father arrived at the hospital, the sun was fully up, casting a pale, gentle yellow light through the trees, a stark contrast to the night's events. I stood up as I saw his familiar figure from a distance, his back slightly stooped, his steps hurried yet heavy. He looked at me for a long time without asking anything, just placing a hand on my shoulder. It was the familiar touch of a father who had carried me through countless storms. "You've gotten thinner," he said, his voice so soft it felt like he was afraid I might shatter. I managed a dry smile. "I'm okay, Dad." He didn't press. He knew me well enough to know that some things, if spoken aloud now, would only bring more pain. We sat together on a stone bench outside the ER, watching people come and go, each carrying their own private sorrow. I told him everything, from the strange powder to the phone call to Betty's confession. He listened without interruption, only tightening his grip on my hand from time to time. When I told him how Nathan had given the drug to his own mother to harm me, my father closed his eyes for a long moment. "I used to think that boy was a good man," he said slowly. "Turns out he was good to the world, but cruel to the one who shared his bed. I didn't defend Nathan, nor did I add to the blame. I just felt my heart settle like water after a flood, exhausted, but clear." That afternoon, the police contacted me and asked me to come to the station to give a formal statement. My dad came with me. In the car, he didn't say much, only one piece of advice. "Tell the truth. Leave the rest to the law." At the station, I met Detective Miller again. He asked me to clarify a few details, cross-referencing them with my statement from the night before. Then he informed me of the preliminary findings. The substance in the chowder was a powerful antibiotic that, when combined with alcohol, could cause severe anaphylactic shock. The camera footage from my apartment had been retrieved, and the delivery driver had also been brought in for questioning. All the pieces were fitting together with cold, unerring precision. "Laura," Detective Miller said, his tone serious but not harsh, "in this case, you are the victim of an attempted murder, but you need to be prepared for your husband's family to react." I nodded. "I've been prepared since I smelled that powder." That evening, I went back to the apartment. It was exactly as I had left it, only now it felt hollow, missing two people. Nathan's room was empty, his shirts hanging neatly, his shoes placed perfectly, as if he had just left on a business trip. I stood before his closet, looking at the shirts I had once ironed for him. The sharp pain was gone, replaced by a sense of profound strangeness. When had this man ceased to be a part of my life? I packed a small suitcase with just my personal documents and a few essential items of clothing. I had no intention of staying here. Before leaving, I checked the security camera feed one last time. The image of Betty, hunched over, sprinkling the white powder, was starkly clear on the screen. I turned it off, closing a chapter of my life. That night, my phone rang nonstop. Relatives from my husband's side called. Some yelled, some begged, some blamed. One called me vicious. Another said I was ungrateful for sending my mother-in-law to prison and letting my husband die an unjust death. I listened for a moment, then hung up. I no longer had the energy to explain myself to people who only wanted to believe what they wanted to believe. There was only one call I answered. It was from Nathan's uncle. "Laura," he said, his voice weary, "it's come to this. Can you find it in your heart to go easy on Betty? After all, she was Nathan's mother." I was silent for a few seconds. I remembered Betty sprinkling the powder, remembered the look in her eyes as she confessed. "Uncle," I replied, "I don't have the power to go easy or not. I only have the right to tell the truth. Guilt or innocence. And the sentence? That's for the law to decide." The other end of the line sighed heavily. I hung up. The following days passed in a strange rhythm. During the day, I worked with the police and my lawyer. At night, I stayed at my parents' house. My mother didn't ask many questions. She just cooked me hot soup and made sure I ate, just as she had when I was a sick child. I slept in my old room, where the familiar smell of wood still lingered. Some nights I would wake with a start, my heart racing, then lie still, reminding myself, I'm alive. The news spread faster than I expected. Old neighbors called to ask questions. Colleagues at the hospital looked at me with a mixture of pity and reservation. Some whispered behind my back. I didn't blame them. People prefer to gossip rather than understand. A week later, I was officially informed. Betty was charged as an accomplice to murder. Nathan was identified as the mastermind, but he was deceased. The investigation was ongoing, focusing on the details related to the insurance policy and assets. I received the news with a heavy heart. Despite everything, hearing that a person I had once called Mom was being indicted was still a painful blow, but I did not turn back. On the day of Nathan's funeral, I didn't go. I sent a wreath of white flowers with no name attached. I knew my presence would only cause more chaos. My parents didn't pressure me. Some farewells are best observed from a distance. That evening, I sat alone on my parents' porch, watching the crescent moon hang in the sky. I thought about my 5 years of marriage, about all the times I had told myself everything would be okay. A difficult mother-in-law was fine, as long as my husband was kind. It turned out I had ignored too many warning signs, simply because I was afraid of losing a home. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my lawyer. "Laura, the insurance company has been in touch. They need to speak with you, as you were the original beneficiary on Nathan's policy. Action Endersley, Frund." I stared at the screen for a long time. Finally, I replied with a short message. "I will cooperate." I knew there was still a long road ahead, legal battles, asset division, public opinion, and the voids within my own heart. But I also knew one thing more clearly than ever. I had escaped. Not by luck, but by staying alert. I stood up and took a deep breath. The night air was cool and clean. I was no longer the woman waiting for pity. I was the one who had looked the truth in the eye and kept walking, and the road ahead, however rough, was my own. The meeting with the insurance company was scheduled for a drizzly morning. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in a corner of the waiting area, my hands resting on my knees, feeling surprisingly calm. The Laura of a month ago would have been trembling, terrified of the numbers, the paperwork, the questions that smelled of money. But after witnessing 3 lives extinguished in one night, those things suddenly felt much lighter. The insurance representative was a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed and spoken. She introduced herself as Helen, her tone businesslike but not cold. "Laura, according to the policy, you are the primary beneficiary. However, because Mr. Collins's death involves a criminal investigation, we need to clarify a few things before we can process any claim." I nodded. "I understand. I'll provide any information you need." The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. I answered every question, from Nathan's daily habits and his evening drinking to whether we had any marital conflicts. Some questions made me pause for a breath, but I didn't evade them. I had no need to protect a man who had chosen to destroy me. When I left, Helen walked me to the door, her expression slightly different than before. "Laura, I've been in this business for over 15 years. Not every wife would be as forthcoming as you." I managed a tired but genuine smile. "It's not that I'm brave, I just don't have any other choice." That afternoon, my lawyer informed me that my joint account with Nathan had been temporarily frozen as part of the investigation. I wasn't surprised. I simply texted back, "I will cooperate." In the following days, I returned to my job at the hospital. At first, my department head suggested I take more time off, but I refused. I needed the work, not for the money, but for the rhythm of life. The hospital, with its smell of medicine, the hurried footsteps, the urgent calls, reminded me that life goes on, regardless of anyone's personal tragedy. Some people looked at me with pity, some avoided my gaze, and some pretended not to know what had happened. I didn't blame them. I did my job, arrived on time, left on time. I didn't elaborate, nor did I hide. If someone asked, I answered concisely. If they didn't, I remained silent. One afternoon, as I was reviewing medication charts, a young nurse timidly approached me. "Laura, I'm sorry if this is out of line, but are you okay?" I looked at her and saw in her eyes not curiosity, but genuine concern. I nodded. "I'm okay. Thank you for asking." That was all, but it was enough to warm my heart a little. Not everyone had turned away. At home, my parents went about their daily lives as usual, but I knew they were watching over me. My mother would often ask, "Did you eat enough?" My father would remind me, "Be careful on the road." These seemingly trivial questions were the anchors that kept me steady. I realized I had neglected these simple things for years, chasing after a family that ultimately never considered me one of their own. One evening, as I was helping my mother with the dishes, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated for a second, then answered, "Is this Laura Collins?" The man's voice was a bit hoarse. "I'm the court-appointed lawyer for Betty Collins." My hands froze, splashing water out of the sink. "How can I help you?" "Mrs. Collins would like to see you. She's asking for your permission." I fell silent. My mother, standing beside me, overheard and looked at me with worry. I covered the phone's receiver. "Mom, I'm just going to step outside for this." I walked out onto the porch. The sky was dark, the wind light. "Please continue," I said into the phone. The lawyer lowered his voice. "She's in a state of panic. She says she just wants to see you one time, to ask for your forgiveness, and to ask you to put in a good word for her." I closed my eyes. The image of Betty, collapsed in the hospital hallway, her eyes filled with despair, flashed in my mind. I didn't hate her enough to wish her dead in prison, but I also couldn't pretend nothing had happened. "I'll think about it," I said, "but I can't make any promises." After that call, I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about the word forgiveness. People say you forgive to lighten your own heart, but I wondered, if I forgave too soon, would it be a betrayal of myself? 2 days later, I decided to go see Betty. The detention center was on the outskirts of the city, the atmosphere heavy and oppressive. When I walked into the visitation room, Betty was already sitting on the other side of the glass partition. She had lost a lot of weight. Her hair was noticeably grayer, and the critical look in her eyes was gone, replaced only by fear and exhaustion. When she saw me, she started to cry silently. "Laura, you came." I picked up the internal phone, my voice calm. "You asked to see me. What is it?" Betty trembled. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I don't dare hope for you to forgive me. I just want you to understand. Nathan manipulated me. I was a fool. My heart sank, but I didn't soften. Do you remember that night, when you were sprinkling the powder into the chowder? What were you thinking then? Betty bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. I thought you would just get a stomachache, go to the hospital, and then get a divorce. I never thought about death. I nodded slowly. But did you ever think about what would happen to my parents if the person who died was me? Betty choked on a sob. She couldn't answer. I continued. I didn't come here to yell at you. I didn't come here to ask for a reduced sentence. I came here to tell you that I survived. But some wounds don't heal just because you survive. Betty looked up, her face streaked with tears. Laura, I know I deserve this. I looked at her for a long time, then spoke slowly. I will not lie to the investigators. I will not ask for leniency by distorting the truth. But I will not add anything either. I will only state exactly what happened. In way, was ported praise. Betty nodded repeatedly, like a drowning person clinging to a piece of wood. That's enough for me. That's enough. The visit ended. As I stood up to leave, Betty called after me. Laura, if there's a next life, I hope we can be strangers. I turned back and said softly, in this life we should probably learn to be strangers to each other too. Leaving the detention center, I took a long, deep breath. I didn't feel relieved, but I no longer felt as heavy as before. Some things just need to be said clearly. They don't need a beautiful ending. A week later, my lawyer informed me that the insurance company would not be paying out the claim, citing evidence of intended fraud. The joint assets would be divided according to the law after all related liabilities were settled. I heard the news without sadness. After everything, money was just something that came after human life. That evening, I sat alone in my room and opened my old suitcase. I took out a sweater I had knitted for Nathan the winter before. I ran my fingers over the stitches. I didn't cry. I folded it neatly, put it in a bag, and took it out to the trash. Some memories only keep you trapped if you hold on to them. I went back inside, closed the door, and stood in front of the mirror. The woman looking back at me was tired, but her eyes were no longer panicked. I realized I had walked through the darkest part. Ahead of me were court dates, public opinion, and lonely days. But I was no longer afraid, because I knew I was walking on my own 2 feet. The days leading up to the trial passed more slowly than I expected. Time no longer rushed by in a torrent as it had when the tragedy first struck, but dripped, heavy, and distinct. Every morning, I woke up at the same time, made tea for my dad, coffee for my mom, and went to work. That rhythm wasn't to forget, but to keep myself from slipping out of ordinary life. At the hospital, I started being assigned night shifts again. My department head called me in, speaking slowly as if afraid to hurt me. Laura, if you're not ready, I can arrange for you to stay on day shifts. I shook my head. I can do it. I need to. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded without another word. I knew she understood. Some pain, if you keep avoiding it, will never pass. One shift, I ran into Ben Miller, the ER doctor who had been on duty the night Nathan was brought in. Back then, he was just a blurred face in a flurry of activity. Now, he stood before me, a hint of hesitation in his eyes. Laura, you don't have to answer if you're not comfortable, but I just wanted to say, I'm very sorry about that night. I was silent for a few seconds, then replied, It wasn't your fault. He exhaled as if relieved. I know, but some cases, no matter how long you've been in the profession, they just stick with you. I looked at him and suddenly realized that everyone carries their own share of memories they'd rather not revisit. I nodded. I understand. That brief conversation made me think for a long time. I wasn't the only one caught in this vortex. Others, intentionally or not, were all left with aftershocks. At home, my mother started mentioning the neighbors more often, not out of curiosity, but out of concern. The people down the street have been staring at you lately. I smiled faintly. They'll get tired of it eventually, Mom. She sighed. People's words can be so cruel, dear. I knew that, but I also knew I couldn't live my whole life trying to please the eyes of others. I just needed to live truthfully. One afternoon, my uncle, my dad's younger brother, came to visit. He brought some fruit, set it on the table, and sat down, his tone somber. I heard about what happened. I nodded. It's okay. A story that big is hard to hide. He looked at me for a long time, then said, I just want to say one thing. You are not at fault. I lowered my head, my hand gripping the hem of my shirt. A simple sentence, but I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear it. Thank you, Uncle. He took a sip of water and continued. Outsiders only see the ending. They don't see what you endured before that. But you know, your parents know, and that's enough. That night, I talked with my dad for a long time. He was a man of few words, but each one carried weight. Laura, if you want to move, your mother and I are ready to help. I shook my head. I don't want to run away yet. This is home. He nodded, not pushing. He placed his calloused but warm hand on my shoulder. Then stand tall. I smiled. Some strengths are not loud, but they are incredibly resilient. The day I received the summons to appear in court, I no longer felt shaky. I read every line carefully, folded it, and placed it on the table. I knew it was an unavoidable part of the journey, but unlike before, I no longer felt alone. My lawyer met with me to prepare my testimony. He was meticulous, reminding me to stay calm, to speak only the truth, and not to let my emotions take over. I listened, but in my heart, I knew some emotions couldn't be completely suppressed. The important thing was not to be led by them. The night before the trial, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the streetlight cast shadows on the wall. I thought about Nathan, not the treacherous husband, but the young man who once smiled so gently while waiting for me under a bridge in the rain. I thought about Betty, not the woman in a jail cell, but the mother-in-law who had once cooked me a hot soup when I first joined their family. Those images weren't there to make me turn back, but to help me understand how much people can change. And that change, sometimes, is not because of circumstances, but because of choices. The next morning, I wore a simple, dark dress, my hair tied back neatly. My mother looked at me, her eyes red, but her voice was firm. Go on, dear. My father stood beside her, saying nothing, just nodding. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy. Betty was led in, her back more stooped than before. When her eyes met mine, she froze. I didn't look away. I looked straight at her, not with defiance or resentment, but simply looking at a person who had reached the end of her mistakes. When I was called to the stand, I walked slowly, deliberately. I heard my own voice, steady and clear, as I recounted what had happened, without additions or omissions. At times, my throat tightened, but I would pause, take a breath, and continue. I did not cry. Not because I didn't feel pain, but because I refused to turn the truth into a melodrama. At one point, the opposing lawyer asked me, "Did you ever resent your mother-in-law?" The courtroom fell silent. I thought for a few seconds, then answered, "Yes, but that resentment never made me wish for her to die or disappear. I just wanted to live." I hadn't prepared that answer. It came from the deepest part of my heart. I saw the expressions on some faces change not to sympathy, but to a state of listening. The trial lasted for hours. When the first day concluded, I walked outside into the late afternoon sun. I stood alone on the courthouse steps, a gentle breeze blowing. I didn't know what the final outcome would be, but I knew I had crossed a significant threshold. That night, I came home exhausted. My mother had a bowl of porridge waiting for me. "Eat, dear." I ate spoonful by spoonful. It was bland but warm. My mother sat across from me, not asking anything, just watching me finish before she spoke. "No matter the result, you are still my daughter." I nodded, and the tears finally came. Not from pain, but from the knowledge that I still had a place to come back to. That night, I slept a long, dreamless sleep. I knew the road ahead still had its rough patches, but I was no longer afraid to face them. The trial entered its second day, the atmosphere even heavier than before. Walking into the courtroom felt like entering another realm, a place where every word spoken could become a milestone for the rest of many people's lives. Betty was led in, her steps slow, her hands trembling. I no longer avoided her gaze, nor did I stare her down. I looked at her with the eyes of someone who had accepted that some relationships are destined to end in ruin. The questioning drilled down into motive. The opposing counsel tried to paint a picture of a deluded mother-in-law led astray by her concern for her son. I listened without reacting. I knew that if one only heard half the story, it was easy to feel pity, but the truth is never a single, isolated piece. When the judge addressed me again, his voice was deep and clear. "Miss Collins, do you believe Mrs. Collins's actions were impulsive, done without a full understanding of the consequences?" I stood up, my hands resting on the witness stand, feeling my own heartbeat. I didn't answer right away. I thought of my years as a daughter-in-law, of every critical glance, every seemingly casual remark that cut deep. "Your Honor," I said slowly, "a person can be impulsive in their words, in a moment of anger. But the act of preparing a drug, waiting for the right moment, and concealing the evidence is not impulsive. It is a choice." The courtroom went silent. I saw Betty's shoulders shake slightly. I felt no satisfaction in that. I only felt sadness. Sadness for a mother who had gone too far in the name of love. When it was Betty's turn to give her final statement, she held the microphone, her hand shaking so badly I feared she would fall. Her voice was a ragged whisper. I was wrong. I don't dare ask for forgiveness. I just want to say, I didn't want Laura to die. I just wanted her to hurt, to be scared, so she would leave my house. Action. Those words rang out, more stark and cruel than any accusation. I closed my eyes for a moment. I wasn't surprised, just met with a cold confirmation of everything I had felt for years. When the court recessed for deliberation, I walked out into the hallway. My parents were sitting in the back row. My mother stood and took my hand. "Are you tired?" I shook my head. "I'm okay." My father said nothing, just handed me a bottle of water. I took a small sip. The water was cool, but my throat was still dry. I knew that no matter the verdict, those words would haunt me for a long time. The wait stretched for over an hour. When the court clerk called everyone back in, my heart pounded. I told myself, I cannot control the verdict, but I can control how I receive it. The sentence was read. Betty was found guilty. Her sentence wasn't the maximum, but it was enough to ensure she paid a price for her choice. I listened to the numbers, the legal terms, as if listening to a professional report. There were no tears, no cries, only the dry, final sound of the gavel. As people began to file out, Betty was led past me. She stopped and turned, her lips moving. "Laura." I looked at her and gave a slight nod. "I heard." She couldn't say anything more. Perhaps all words were useless now. She turned and was led away. I watched her stooped back, my heart feeling empty, not triumphant, not relieved, just a long, quiet pause. The days following the trial, public interest faded. People moved on to other stories. I returned to my familiar rhythm, but one thing had changed profoundly. I no longer avoided the past. I began to clean out the small house that had once been my and Nathan's home. I went there one afternoon, alone. The house was quiet, with a faint smell of dampness. I opened the windows to let the breeze in. I walked through each room, taking my time. In the drawer of the nightstand, I found an old notebook of Nathan's. The first few pages were work plans, numbers, goals. On the last page, a few lines were scrawled. "Once this is done, I'll have more time." I closed the notebook. More time for what? I no longer wanted to know. I gathered the remaining belongings into boxes, not smashing anything, not throwing things haphazardly. I worked like someone finishing a long shift. When I was done, I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. I didn't cry. I just breathed, deeply, as if for the first time I was breathing just for myself. That night, I called my lawyer to discuss the sale of the house. He asked if I was sure. I said I was. I no longer wanted to live in a space filled with memories that didn't belong to me anymore. At the hospital, I was offered a role in a new project. It meant more work, more pressure, but I accepted. I needed the challenge. I needed the feeling of moving forward, not being stuck at a breaking point. One afternoon, the young nurse from before brought me a carton of milk. "Laura, remember to eat properly, okay?" I smiled. "Thank you." These small, quiet acts of kindness were enough to remind me that I wasn't invisible. One evening, I came home late. My mother had left a plate of food for me, carefully covered. I sat alone in the kitchen, eating, listening to the sound of the television from the living room where my dad was watching the news. Everything was so normal, it almost made me forget there was a time I thought I could never return to this. After dinner, my mother came into the kitchen and asked softly, "Do you regret getting married?" I thought for a moment, then answered, "No, I only regret not listening to myself sooner." My mother nodded. She understood. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and took off my wedding ring. I placed it in its box and put it away in a drawer, not to keep, but to close. I looked at the woman in the mirror. She was no longer a bride, no longer a daughter-in-law. She was just Laura, and that was enough. I knew the road ahead still had many turns. Maybe I would be alone for a long time. Maybe I would love again, or maybe not. But this time, I would not trade my safety and self-respect for any title. As I turned off the light and lay down, my heart was calmer. I no longer hoped for a fairy tale happy ending. I just hoped for a life where I didn't have to bow my head to fear. After the trial, my life didn't suddenly become easier, but it became clearer, as clear as water after a heavy rain still rippled, but no longer murky. I moved out of the old house on a weekend morning. The sun was gentle. There was no party, no farewell, just boxes, a small moving truck, and a decision that had been considered long enough. The new apartment I rented was near the hospital, small, bright, and quiet. The day I moved in, my mother came with me, carrying a basket of food. My dad drove the car slowly, as if afraid things were moving too fast. After placing a new pot on the stove, my mother turned and asked, "Do you need anything else?" I shook my head. I needed very little, really. A bed, a table, a corner for my teapot. I left the rest of the space empty, as if saving it for the days to come. The first night in the new apartment, I didn't turn on the TV. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the traffic below. The sounds of the city were steady, not yet familiar, but not alien either. I realized then that a sense of security doesn't necessarily come from a house you once called home. It comes from no longer having to live in fear of what might happen behind your back. In the following weeks, work consumed me. The new project demanded time and focus. I worked more than before, but I was no longer tired in the old way. Before, I was exhausted from trying to hold together a fracturing family while working. Now, I was tired from doing my job well, from knowing I was building something for myself. Some days, after a late shift, I would stop at a small diner down the street for a bowl of hot soup. The owner, recognizing my face, would ask, "Late shift again?" I would nod. Those simple, everyday questions made me feel like I was a part of life, not just an observer. One rainy afternoon, I received a text from my lawyer. The sale of the house was complete. I read it without sadness, just texted back a thank you. Then I put my phone down and watched the rain. Some doors close without a sound. They just quietly shut so you can't look back. That evening, my dad called, his voice even and low. "Come over for dinner this weekend." I said yes. Nothing more. Between us, few words were needed. I went to my parents' house on Saturday afternoon. My mother made sour soup. My father cooked braised fish, familiar dishes, familiar smells. I ate slowly, listening to the clinking of chopsticks against bowls. My dad talked about my uncle fixing his roof. My mother mentioned a neighbor who was sick. No one mentioned the trial, Betty or Nathan. Not because they were avoiding it, but because we all understood that some things had been said enough. After dinner, I sat on the porch with my dad. The sky was dark, the air cool. He lit a cigarette, took one drag, and then put it out. "Laura," he said my name, his voice low, "what are your plans now?" I thought for a moment. "Work, live a normal life. The rest can wait." My dad nodded, his gaze softening. "I don't need you to be better than anyone else. I just need you to be at peace." I smiled. Some parental wishes are so simple, people often forget them. In the days that followed, I received a letter. The handwriting was shaky and uneven. I recognized it immediately as Betty's. The letter was short. No begging, no blaming. She wrote that she was serving her sentence, that she missed the meals from long ago, and that she understood she had no right to hope for my forgiveness. The last line read, "If you are living well, I can be at peace." I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I didn't reply, not out of hatred, but because I had already said what needed to be said. Some relationships just need to be kept at the right distance. At the hospital, I started mentoring some of the new staff. A young pharmacist named Hannah was always asking me direct questions. Once, she asked, "Laura, this job is so stressful. Why do you stay?" I looked at her, thought for a moment, and replied, "Because sometimes, just doing your job right is enough to save someone." I didn't elaborate. She nodded, perhaps not fully understanding yet, but she would. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave, Ben Miller called out to me. He handed me a light jacket. "It's getting cold. You forgot this." I took it and said thank you. He didn't ask anything more. That quiet, measured consideration felt comfortable. I realized that after everything, I hadn't closed myself off from the world. I had just learned to be more selective. I started jogging every morning. The path around the park wasn't long, but it was enough for me to breathe deeply. With each steady step, I could feel that my body was still strong, still alive. Some mornings I ran slowly, just to watch the sunrise. Other mornings I ran fast, to release any lingering emotional residue. The body, like the mind, needs movement to avoid getting stuck. One day, my mother called, her voice a little worried. "Did you hear? Betty was transferred to a medical facility." I was silent for a second. "I know," my mother sighed. "I just don't want you to dwell on it." I smiled faintly. "I'm okay, Mom, really." And I meant it. I no longer thought much about Betty. She had gone down her path. I was walking mine. The two paths no longer intersected. I gradually grew accustomed to evenings alone. I read books, listened to music, cooked. Loneliness sometimes visited, but it wasn't as frightening as I once imagined. Now, loneliness felt like a necessary quiet space to hear my own thoughts clearly. One rainy night I got a call from an unknown number. I answered, "Laura? It's Hannah." "Yes, Hannah. What's up?" "I just wanted to say thank you. I had a difficult case today. I remembered what you said." I smiled. "Keep it up. We all have days like that." The call was short, but it was enough to make me feel that what I had gone through wasn't entirely meaningless. If it helped me understand others better, helped me remain calmer in the face of someone else's suffering, then perhaps that was life's way of compensating. I stood by the window, watching the rain fall. I thought about the road I had traveled, not with regret, but with acknowledgement. I had survived. Not just survived a fateful night, but survived my own illusions. I no longer needed someone else to validate my worth. I did it myself, every day, by living with kindness toward myself. As I turned off the light and lay down, I breathed evenly. Tomorrow, I would wake up early again, go to work again, and take another step forward. No grand promises needed, just the simple act of living each day without bowing my head to fear. That year, the rainy season came later than usual. The first showers weren't torrential downpours but a gentle rain, just enough to wash the dust from the leaves of the trees lining the street. I grew accustomed to returning to my small apartment after dark, turning on the kitchen light, cooking a simple meal, and eating in silence. No one asked why I was late. No one chided me for not waiting. That sense of freedom, at first a bit empty, gradually became a part of my rhythm. Work at the hospital entered a peak period. The new project required me to coordinate with several other departments. My meeting schedule was packed, and my responsibilities grew. Some nights, I didn't get home until nearly midnight. I was tired, but it was no longer the same kind of exhaustion. This was the fatigue of meaningful work, a world away from the exhaustion of struggling to exist in a family where every step was a minefield. One afternoon, my department head called me into her office. She closed the door and poured me a glass of water. "Laura, I want to talk to you about something." I sat up straight, my mind racing through possibilities, but I wasn't worried. "Yes?" The hospital is proposing to send someone for a 6-month advanced training program overseas. I've considered the options, and I want to nominate you." I was stunned, not because it was a surprise, but because I hadn't thought my name would even be in consideration at this time. "Me? You think I'm a good fit?" She looked at me, her gaze serious. "Professionally, you are more than qualified, and in terms of resilience, I trust you more than most." I was silent for a few seconds. 6 months. Not too short, not too long. Going or staying was a major choice. "I'll need some time to think about it," I said. "Of course, no need to answer right away." That evening I called my parents. My dad listened and neither objected nor pushed. "It's your decision. We'll support you." My mother, however, had more questions. "It's so far away. Can you handle it?" I laughed. "I can handle it, Mom. I've handled things that were much harder." My mother was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Then you should go. It will be a good experience." I hung up and looked around my small room. I thought about the years when every decision I made had to be weighed against what Nathan would think, what his mother would think. Now, for the first time, the only question was, what do I want? In the days that followed, I thought a lot. Not because I was afraid to go, but because I understood that if I went, I would truly be closing a chapter. Leaving this city, even temporarily, meant leaving a place filled with memories. But I wasn't running away. I just wanted to give myself some distance to look back. One morning, while out for a run, I saw Ben Miller. He greeted me and slowed his pace to run alongside me. "You've gotten thinner lately," he remarked. "Probably from all the running," I replied. He hesitated for a moment, then asked, "I heard you might be going away for a while." I was surprised. "How did you know?" He smiled. "It's a small hospital. News travels fast." I nodded. "I'm considering it." He looked ahead, his voice thoughtful. "You should go. Sometimes a change of scenery helps you breathe easier." I looked at him, realizing he wasn't speaking as someone with a personal interest, but as someone who understood from experience. "Thank you," I said. We didn't say anything more. Some advice only needs to be heard once. I decided to accept the nomination. When I submitted the paperwork, my hand was steady. I felt like I was actively stepping into a new chapter, not being pushed by tragedy. My department head shook my hand, a rare smile on her face. "I have faith in you." The weeks of preparation flew by. I organized my work, handed over my responsibilities to a colleague. At home, I cleared out my apartment, sold some furniture, and kept only what was truly necessary. I didn't pack many keepsakes. I didn't need them to remember who I was. The night before my flight, I had dinner with my parents. My mother made chicken soup, my favorite dish since childhood. My dad poured me a cup of tea. "Take care of yourself over there," he said. "I will." My mother looked at me, her eyes red. "Call us if anything happens." I nodded. "I promise." That night, I lay in my old room, looking at the familiar ceiling. I remembered the last time I had slept here before getting married, my heart filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Back then, I thought marriage was the destination. Now, I understood that no destination is more important than arriving with yourself intact. The next morning, my parents saw me off at the airport. There were no tears, no long goodbyes. My dad just patted my shoulder. "Go on, honey." I pulled my suitcase and turned back to look at them, standing behind the glass. I smiled and waved. I wasn't carrying sadness with me. I was carrying peace. In a foreign place, my rhythm of life changed completely. A different language, different people, a different way of working. It was tiring at first, but this fatigue was born of challenge, not trauma. I studied, I worked, I took notes, I debated. Some nights I was homesick, but I wasn't homesick for my old life. I would call my parents, hear their voices, and then sleep soundly. Once, at a conference, I was invited to share my experience on crisis management in a medical environment. Standing in front of a room full of strangers, I suddenly remembered myself from a year ago. I didn't tell my personal story, but in every word I spoke, I knew I was speaking from real experience. I saw the way some people looked at me change, not with curiosity, but with respect. Some evenings, I would sit alone in my rented room, watching the snow fall outside the window. I thought about Nathan, about Betty, with no more resentment and no more pity. Each of them had chosen their path, and so had I. The difference was, I had chosen a path that didn't harm anyone in order to keep living. A text from my mother arrived as I was getting ready for bed. "Everything is fine at home. Focus on your studies." I read it and smiled. I knew that behind me there was always a place to return to, but ahead of me was where I needed to go. 6 months didn't make me forget the past. It just helped me put the past in its proper place. When I returned, I would no longer be the woman swept away by tragedy, but the woman who had walked through it, carrying its lessons, not its burdens. I turned off the light and lay down. Outside, another city slept. I closed my eyes and breathed evenly. I was no longer afraid of the future, because this time, I was walking by my own choice. 6 months passed more quickly than I had imagined. The day I packed my bags to return home, the city I was leaving had just entered the late winter. The snow was melting, revealing patches of brown grass and cold, wet pavement. I stood at the window of my rented room, pulling my suitcase close. My heart felt neither the excitement of my departure nor the emptiness I had once known, just a sense of completeness, as if I had finished a necessary cycle in my life. The flight was long. I sat by the window, watching the clouds drift below the wing. I thought about the days that had passed the intense classes, the long discussions, the quiet evenings cooking for one in a tiny kitchen, listening to soft music. I was no longer the Laura who only knew how to endure. I hadn't become someone else either. I was just myself, clearer, stronger. When the plane landed, I turned on my phone. A text from my mother was already there. "Where are you now?" I replied, "Just landed. Don't worry." My dad was there to pick me up. He stood in the arrivals area, wearing an old shirt, holding his familiar hat. When he saw me, he just nodded. No hug, no effusive greeting, but I could see the relief in his eyes. "Tired from the flight?" "It was okay, Dad." On the way home, he told me stories about the neighborhood, about my uncle becoming a grandfather, about the starfruit tree in their yard bearing fruit. These seemingly small stories made me feel like I had truly come home, not to hide, but to continue living. My mother was waiting at the house. Dinner was vegetable soup, braised fish, and even salted pickles. I ate with a hearty appetite. My mother watched me and said softly, "You've changed." I smiled. "For the better, I hope." She nodded, her eyes welling up. After a few days of rest, I returned to the hospital. My department head shook my hand, asked a few brief questions, and then assigned me my work. I went back to my old desk. The drawer still held a few old sticky notes. I cleaned it out, reorganized everything. It was all familiar, but not old. One afternoon, I ran into Ben Miller in the cafeteria. He smiled at me. "You really do look different. Better or worse?" I teased. "Better," he replied instantly. "At the very least, you've lost that guarded look in your eyes." I was quiet for a moment. He was right. I no longer saw the world through the eyes of someone afraid of being hurt. We talked a little more about work. We didn't bring up the past. It wasn't necessary. Some relationships are comfortable simply because the right distance is maintained. One afternoon, I received a notification from the correctional facility. Betty had requested to send another letter. I hesitated for a second, then accepted it. The letter was shorter than the last. She wrote that she had been sick, that her health was failing. She didn't blame me, didn't ask for anything. She just wrote, "I know it's too late for everything. Knowing that you are living well is enough." I read it and folded it. This time, I felt no weight. I put the letter in the same drawer as the first one. I wouldn't read them again, but I wouldn't throw them away either. It was my way of closing the door without hatred, without guilt. My parents never asked about Betty, and I never brought her up. My family chose silence in the face of things that could not be changed, and I saw in that the wisdom of experience. One weekend evening, my uncle came to visit. He looked at me and smiled kindly. "You look much brighter since you came back." I laughed along. "It's probably because I'm getting enough sleep." He nodded sagely. To be able to sleep well is a blessing. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. It was true. To eat well, to sleep well, to live without constant fear, that was a great blessing indeed. I began to think about the future in a new way, no longer about who I would marry or how to live to please others. I thought about more concrete things: another course, a short trip, a small house with plenty of light. I wasn't in a hurry. I wasn't afraid of being slow. I had moved too fast in the past, rushing to become a wife and a daughter-in-law. Not anymore. One evening, my mother asked me as she peeled fruit, "If someone comes into your life in the future, will you be afraid?" I thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "Of course I will be, Mom, but I won't stay in a relationship that costs me my safety just because I'm afraid." My mother put down the knife and looked at me. "Then I can rest easy." I understood. She didn't need me to have a new family. She just needed me not to repeat the same mistakes. As the end of the year approached, the hospital grew busier. I worked a lot, but my heart was steady. There were tired moments, frustrated moments, but I knew how to stop. That was something I had learned, knowing when to stop. One evening after my shift, I stood on the hospital steps, watching the flow of people. I thought about the Laura of a year ago, the woman standing in an ER hallway at 3 a.m., her hands cold, her heart full of fear. If I could say one thing to her, I would say, "You will survive, and you will live well." I turned and blended into the crowd. No one knew who I was or what I had been through, and I found that liberating. I didn't need my story to be a label on my forehead. It just needed to be a lesson I carried with me. That night, I went home, made tea, and sat alone. The sound of traffic outside faded. I thought about the rest of my life's journey. No grand promises, no rosy visions. Just one day at a time, lived without betraying myself. I turned off the light and lay down. A deep, dreamless sleep. I knew I had truly come home, not just to a place, but to myself. That winter, the city experienced a rare cold spell. In the early morning, I walked to work through a thin mist, my coat buttoned up, my steps unhurried. I realized I had stopped rushing. Not because there was less to do, but because I no longer felt like I was being chased. I moved at my own pace. At the hospital, the project I was part of began to show results. The report was approved, and new procedures were being implemented. My department head called me in and placed an evaluation in front of me. "Laura, the board was very impressed with your contribution. There may be more responsibility coming your way." I nodded. "I'm ready." She smiled at me. "You seem so different now. You were always competent, but you used to be withdrawn. Now, you stand taller." "Thank you," I said. I understood that change didn't come from a new skill set, but from no longer having to split my energy to fight a battle outside of work. When a person is no longer afraid, they naturally become stronger. One afternoon, as I was packing up, Hannah, the young pharmacist, stopped by. "Laura, we're having a small department get-together tonight. You should come." I hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Okay, I'll be there." The gathering was simple: some food, some jokes. I listened more than I talked. Looking at the young faces, I suddenly felt I had traveled a very long way, even if I wasn't much older than them. At one point, Hannah turned to me and asked, "Laura, if you had to choose again, would you choose this path?" I looked at her without answering right away. "Yes," I said after a moment, "but I would have chosen it sooner." She smiled, probably not understanding everything. That was okay. Everyone has to find their own answers. As the holidays approached, my parents began cleaning the house. I went over to help my mom polish the family altar and rehang old pictures. The familiar scent of incense calmed my heart. My mother, cleaning beside me, said, "There are fewer people in our house this year." I knew what she was thinking. I put down my cloth and said softly, "But it's more peaceful, Mom." She looked at me and nodded, not arguing. On New Year's Eve, I stood on the porch with my dad. Fireworks from a distant celebration bloomed in the sky, silent but brilliant. My dad, hands clasped behind his back, spoke as if to himself. "I was worried you wouldn't make it through last year." I remained silent. "But you did," he continued, "and that's enough. I turned to look at my father. For the first time in a long time, I saw not the constant worry in his eyes, but a sense of peace. For me, that was the greatest gift. The first few days of the new year passed quietly. I received a few calls from distant relatives and a couple of subtle matchmaking suggestions. My mother asked for my opinion. I just smiled. "Later, Mom. I don't need it right now." She didn't push. She understood that some voids need to be filled with peace first, not with another person. One morning, I received a call from the correctional facility. Betty wanted to see me one last time before being transferred to a different medical facility due to her poor health. I thought about it for a long time. Finally, I agreed. This time, Betty looked much weaker. She sat quietly, not crying. When she saw me, she just nodded, her voice a whisper. "You came." "Yes." We sat in silence for a moment before she spoke. "I don't hope for anything anymore. I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're alive." I looked at her. In that moment, I no longer saw her as my mother-in-law or as a defendant. She was just an old woman who had paid too high a price for her blindness. "I'm alive," I replied, "because I chose not to have absolute faith." Betty nodded, a tear rolling slowly down her cheek. If only I had thought more clearly that day. "That day is over," I said. "Take care of your health." She looked at me, her eyes a mix of gratitude and regret. "You should go. Don't come back again." I stood up. Before I left, I added one more thing, very softly. "I will live well. You can be at peace." Leaving the facility, I felt light. Not because I had forgiven, but because I was no longer bound by the question of what if. I had done my part. Returning to my daily rhythm, I began to make more time for myself. I learned to cook new dishes, read, and planted a few small pots on my balcony. Every morning, I watered them and watched new leaves sprout, feeling my own spirit grow greener alongside them. One evening, Ben Miller texted me, asking if I was free for coffee. I thought about it, then agreed. We sat in a small cafe, talking about work and ordinary things. No one mentioned the past. No one set expectations. I felt at ease. As we were leaving, he said, "Laura, if you ever feel like you're not okay, it's all right to say so. You don't always have to be so strong." I looked at him and smiled. "I'm not trying to be strong anymore. I'm just trying to be real." He nodded. We said our goodbyes. I knew this wasn't the start of something grand, but I also knew I was no longer closing the door. That night, I went home and stood in front of the mirror for a long time. The woman looking back was calm, not happy, not sad. Just someone who had been through enough storms to understand that peace isn't a gift from heaven, but the result of making decisive choices. I lay down, listening to the wind outside my window. I thought about the road ahead. No one knows what it holds, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to being the woman who accepted a life of fear in exchange for a title. My life, from now on, would be built of days just like this one, slow, real, and with nothing to prove to anyone. Spring arrived gently that year, not with long drizzles or lingering cold, but with mornings of soft sunlight and a breeze just cool enough to make you want to open the windows early. I stood on the balcony of my small apartment, watering the potted plants that had been with me for a year. Their leaves were a vibrant green, their roots holding firm in the soil. I realized that people are like plants. If you put them in the right place, they know how to live. My work settled into a new, stable rhythm. It was no longer about proving I was better than anyone, but about working with focus and calm. I didn't take on extra responsibilities just to fill a void. I chose tasks that were challenging enough for growth but not so much as to cause burnout. My department head would sometimes look at me and nod with satisfaction. I didn't need praise. I knew I was in the right place. One rare afternoon when I got off work early, I stopped by my parents' house. My mother was trimming vegetables. My dad was watching TV. The scene was so familiar that I had once taken it for granted, forgetting it entirely during my years as a daughter-in-law. "You're home?" My mother looked up. "Just stopping by." She smiled, her hands still moving deftly. My dad turned off the TV. "Staying for dinner?" I nodded. The meal wasn't fancy, but it tasted delicious, not because of the food, but because of the atmosphere. No one pried, no one brought up the past. We talked about the garden, the neighborhood kids, my uncle's plan to fix his porch. This ordinary life, which I had once found boring, was now what I cherished most. After dinner, my mother handed me a small wooden box. I was cleaning out the closet and found this. I opened it. It was my old wedding ring. I had left it at my parents' house long ago and forgotten about it. "Keep it or get rid of it. It's up to you," she said. I held the ring, looking at it for a long time. A small object that once represented a whole vow. I placed it back in the box and closed the lid. "I'll keep it, not to remember, but to remind myself of what I walked through." My mother nodded without asking more. That night, back in my apartment, I placed the box in the deepest part of a drawer, not locked away, not hidden. Some things just need to be known, not seen. Time passed. Ben Miller and I still met occasionally. Coffee, conversation, sometimes a quick meal after a shift. Neither of us put a name on it. Neither of us pushed. I wasn't afraid to move forward, but I wasn't in a hurry either. I had learned that inner security is more important than having someone by your side to fill a role. Once, he asked me directly, "Are you open to starting over someday?" I looked at him without flinching. "If I feel like I don't have to trade my peace for it, then yes." He nodded, not asking more. I appreciated that. Not everyone has the patience to wait for someone who has been through so much. One morning in early summer, I received news that Betty had been moved to a long-term care facility. Her health was poor but stable. I read the message and put my phone down, feeling no turmoil in my heart. I understood that the final tie between me and my old family had truly loosened, not because the resentment had vanished, but because I no longer stood in a position where I needed to feel it. At the hospital, Hannah was promoted. She ran to tell me the news, her eyes shining. "Laura, I got it!" I smiled genuinely. "Congratulations." Looking at her, I saw a reflection of myself from long ago, but with one difference. I hoped she would never have to pay the price for her success with the kind of loss I had endured. Some evenings, I would sit alone, listening to the rain outside my window. I would think about that fateful night years ago when I stood in the dark hallway, smelled the strange powder, and made the choice not to eat. A small choice, but one that had veered my life in a completely different direction. If I had been careless that day, if I had trusted my old routine just a little bit more, I didn't dare think further. But I was no longer afraid to think about it. I saw it as a turning point, not to haunt me, but to make me grateful for my own alertness. One night, my dad called, his voice slow. "Laura, your mother and I are getting older. We don't wish for anything more than for you to live in peace." I felt a lump in my throat. "I know, Dad, I promise." He didn't say more. For him, that promise was enough. I started making plans for very small things. A short trip within the country, a class I was interested in, adding more flowers to my balcony. No more long-term plans that had to be tied to someone else. I lived day by day, but not aimlessly. I was building my life like someone rebuilding a house after a hurricane, slowly, solidly, and with great clarity. Once, Hannah asked me, "Laura, after everything, what's the biggest lesson you learned?" I thought for a moment, then answered, "To not treat endurance as a virtue. Not everyone who is patient is a good person. Sometimes, having the courage to walk away is the right thing to do." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. One weekend afternoon, I stood on a bridge, watching the traffic flow below. The wind was strong, blowing my hair gently. I was no longer the woman who bowed her head to criticism, who asked herself what she did wrong when she was treated poorly. I understood very clearly. Some wrongs don't belong to you, and your job is not to fix them for others, but to leave at the right time. I turned my back and kept walking. No one called after me, and I didn't look back. My life didn't end with a fairy tale happy ending. No new wedding, no new vows. But it had something more important. I was alive, living fully, consciously, and without betraying myself. If someone were to ask me now what happiness is, I wouldn't speak of grand things. I would say it's being able to eat a meal without fear, to sleep a night without dread, and to walk my own path without needing anyone's permission. And for me, that is enough.